July 23, 1944, 8:47 a.m., Normandy hedgerow country outside St. Lo. Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski, tank commander of Sherman Iron Duke, with Company B, 2nd Armored Division, watched the black smoke rising from 3 burning American tanks in the field ahead. The company had lost 5 Shermans in 2 days to German Panther and Tiger tanks whose 88mm guns could punch through Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. Every tanker in the European theater knew the terrifying math: 5 Shermans lost for every German heavy tank destroyed. What the Wehrmacht didn't know was that American engineers had quietly solved the problem that killed more tank crews than enemy fire. In the next 18 minutes, that ignorance would cost Germany 3 Panther tanks and change how both sides viewed the Sherman's survivability. Because sometimes the difference between burning alive and walking away isn't thicker armor, it's 6 inches of glycerin solution nobody thought would matter. This is the story of how wet ammunition storage transformed the Sherman from Ronson lighter into a tank that could take punishment no panzer could survive. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Tommy Kowalski grew up in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Jones and Laughlin Steel. By age 16, Tommy was hefting 100-pound iron bars alongside men twice his age. When Pearl Harbor happened, he was 23, married 6 months, working the night shift. He enlisted December 8, 1941. The Army assigned him to armored forces. His steel mill experience translated directly to tank maintenance. He understood metallurgy, stress points, welding. At Fort Knox, instructors noticed his mechanical intuition. During gunnery training, he could predict when a gun tube would fail based on barrel temperature and firing rate. They made him a tank commander. Company B, 2nd Armored Division, formed up at Fort Benning in early 1943. They received M4A1 Sherman tanks with 75mm guns and trained for 14 months before shipping to England in April 1944. Kowalski's crew included driver Private Marcus Jackson from Alabama, Gunner Corporal David Chen from San Francisco, Loader Private Antonio Marino from Brooklyn, and Assistant Driver Bow Gunner Private Robert Hayes from Iowa. They landed at Omaha Beach on June 18, 1944, 12 days after D-Day. The hedgerows of Normandy became a nightmare of close-range ambush, where German tanks could appear at 50 yards with no warning. By July 1944, Sherman crews in Normandy faced casualty rates approaching 40% in units engaging German armor. The 2nd Armored Division had lost 23 tanks in 3 weeks. Most burned completely after being hit, incinerating crews who couldn't escape in the 5 to 7 seconds before ammunition cooked off. Lieutenant William Morrison, commanding officer of 3rd Platoon, died July 19th. His Sherman took an 88mm round through the right sponson at 1,100 yards near Cannae. The German Panther that fired it remained hull down behind a hedgerow, invisible. Morrison's tank exploded in a fireball so intense it melted the suspension bogies. All 5 crew members died instantly. Kowalski had been 70 yards behind Morrison when it happened. He watched his platoon leader's Sherman erupt like a Roman candle, flames shooting 40 feet in the air. The explosion was so violent it blew the turret completely off, sending it tumbling 20 yards away. Through his periscope, Kowalski saw the ammunition racks cooking off in sequence, each shell detonating individually, turning the tank's interior into a blast furnace. That night, back at the company assembly area, Kowalski inspected the smoldering wreck. The armor had held. The 88mm round penetrated cleanly, leaving an entry hole barely 4 inches across. but once inside, the round had struck the ammunition storage in the sponson. 75 rounds of 75mm ammunition had detonated in a confined space. The pressure wave alone had killed the crew before the fire consumed them. Battalion Maintenance Officer Captain James Harrison stood beside him. "Fifth one this week," Harrison said quietly. "Same story every time. Penetration, ammo cook-off, total loss. Wehrmacht knows exactly where our ammo racks are located." "The new tanks," Kowalski said. "The M4A3s coming from the States. I heard something about different ammo storage." Harrison pulled out a technical bulletin. "Wet stowage. Started production in March. Water-glycerin jackets around the ammunition bins. Theory is the liquid absorbs heat from penetrations, prevents cook-off." He paused. "We're supposed to get our first batch next week." What Captain Harrison didn't emphasize, what most commanders didn't understand yet, was how radical the wet stowage system actually was. American engineers at Army Ordnance had been studying Sherman losses since North Africa. The data was brutal. 60 to 80% of destroyed Shermans suffered catastrophic ammunition fires. Crews called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." The problem wasn't the Sherman's armor or gun, it was ammunition placement. Original M4 designs stored 75 rounds of 75mm ammunition in sponson racks along both sides of the hull, exactly where German rounds were most likely to penetrate after punching through the relatively thin side armor. A single penetrating hit would ignite propellant charges. Within seconds, all 75 rounds would cook off in a chain reaction. Engineers tried everything: thicker armor, too heavy; spaced armor, too complex; moving ammunition to the turret, reduced capacity. The solution came from naval fire suppression systems. What if ammunition bins were surrounded by liquid-filled jackets? Water had enormous thermal mass. It could absorb tremendous heat before boiling. Mixed with glycerin to prevent freezing, it could give crews precious seconds to escape or prevent ignition entirely. The M4A3 wet stowage, Sherman relocated ammunition to the hull floor in armored bins surrounded by 6-inch water-glycerin jackets containing approximately 3 gallons of solution per bin. Total liquid capacity, 18 gallons. The system added 430 pounds to the tank's weight, but reduced ammunition capacity by only 15 rounds. First production tanks rolled off Detroit Arsenal assembly lines in March 1944. By July, they were arriving in Normandy in limited numbers. Most crews didn't know what wet stowage meant. Some thought it was waterproofing for amphibious operations. Almost nobody understood it was designed to prevent the very explosions that had killed Lieutenant Morrison and hundreds of other American tankers. Kowalski's platoon, now under temporary command of Lieutenant Robert Fisher, was advancing through hedgerow country south of St. Lo as part of Operation Cobra's preliminary actions. Intelligence reported German armor operating in the area, at least one company of Panthers from Panzer Lehr Division. The terrain was impossible. Ancient Norman hedgerows, thick earthen banks topped by dense vegetation, divided every field into small parcels 50 to 100 yards across. Visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. German tanks could hide in tree lines and fire point blank at American columns moving through the narrow lanes between hedgerows. At 8:47 a.m., leading elements of 3rd Platoon entered a field designated map reference 442-337. 3 Shermans, Lieutenant Fisher's tank in the lead, Sergeant Mike O'Brien's tank second, Kowalski's Iron Duke third position. The field was roughly 80 yards across with hedgerows on all sides. An apple orchard occupied the eastern edge. O'Brien's Sherman crossed the hedgerow first. Kowalski heard his voice on the radio. "Lead tank, 3 o'clock tree line, hull down." The German Panther fired first. The 80 mm armor-piercing round covered 80 yards in a fraction of a second, striking O'Brien's Sherman on the right front glacis at a 20-degree angle. The round penetrated, deflecting downward into the hull. Kowalski saw the impact, a bright flash, the tank lurching sideways from the kinetic energy transfer. And then, nothing. No explosion. No fireball. O'Brien's Sherman rolled forward another 10 yards before stopping. The engine was still running. Through his periscope, Kowalski saw the crew hatches pop open. O'Brien climbed out, followed by his gunner and loader. All three dropped to the ground and sprinted toward the tree line. "What the hell?" Kowalski muttered. A penetrating 80 mm hit should have turned that tank into an inferno within 5 seconds. But O'Brien's crew was walking away. "Gunner," Kowalski said into the intercom. "Panther, Apple Orchard, 11 o'clock, 200 yards, hull down position, load AP." Chen traversed the turret. Identified, range 200. "Fire when ready." The Sherman's 75 mm gun fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted upward. The Panther's glacis was too thick for 75 mm penetration at this range. But the Panther's commander, rattled by incoming fire, pulled back deeper into the tree line. "Driver, back us out," Kowalski ordered. "Get behind that hedgerow." Jackson reversed the Sherman 70 yards, positioning behind the earthen bank. Kowalski climbed out of the turret to check on O'Brien's crew. They were crouched in a drainage ditch, uninjured. "O'Brien, what the hell just happened?" "Got hit right through the front," O'Brien said, still catching his breath. "Felt it punch through. But no fire. No ammo explosion. We just got out." Kowalski examined O'Brien's tank from 30 yards away, using binoculars. The entry hole was visible on the right glacis. The tank was still running, turret intact. Normally, by now, the whole vehicle would be a smoking shell. Instead, it looked like it had taken a minor hit. "That's a wet stowage tank," Kowalski realized. "The new M4A3. The what?" "Liquid-cooled ammo bins. Army Ordnance modification. I saw the technical bulletin last week." He looked at the crew. "That liquid stopped your ammunition from cooking off. That's why you're alive." At 9:19 a.m., Company B's executive officer, Captain Stephen Walsh, arrived at map reference 442-337 with 2 more Shermans. Lieutenant Fisher briefed him on the engagement. Walsh examined O'Brien's damaged tank closely. "This is the first wet stowage tank hit in combat in our battalion," Walsh said, and the crew walked away from an 80 mm penetration. He turned to Kowalski. "Sergeant, how many Shermans in the company have wet stowage?" "4, sir. Mine, O'Brien's, Lieutenant Davis's, and Sergeant Williams's." "Then those 4 tanks are going point from now on." Walsh pulled out a map. "Panzer Lehr has at least 8 Panthers operating in this sector. They've been ambushing our columns for 3 days. If wet stowage gives us survivability advantage, I want to exploit it." The tactical situation was straightforward. German armor was dominating through superior firepower and protection. Their 88 mm guns could kill Shermans at ranges where Sherman's 75 mm guns couldn't penetrate Panther armor. But if wet stowage Shermans could survive hits that would destroy regular M4s, American numerical superiority became decisive. 5 Shermans could engage 1 Panther, accept losses, and still win through volume of fire. It was brutal calculus, but it was math that might work. July 23, 1:30 p.m. Company B received orders to clear German armor from the Villiers-Fossard area, 3 kilometers south of St. Lo. Intelligence estimated 2 to 3 Panthers plus supporting infantry. The narrow lanes and dense hedgerows favored defenders. Captain Walsh devised a plan. Use the 4 wet stowage Shermans as lead elements to draw fire and identify German positions. Once Panthers revealed themselves by firing, supporting Shermans would maneuver for flank shots, the only reliable way to kill Panthers with 75mm guns. Kowalski's stomach tightened when he heard the plan. Being used as bait was terrifying, but he understood the logic. If his tank could survive a frontal 88mm hit, it gave the company a chance. "Chen," Kowalski said to his gunner, "we're going to take hits today. When we do, stay calm. The wet stowage gives us time. Focus on returning fire." "How much time?" "I don't know. O'Brien had maybe 10 seconds before he bailed. Maybe more. Point is, we're not blowing up instantly." The column moved out at 1:45 p.m. 4 wet stowage Shermans led, Kowalski, O'Brien, in a replacement tank, Lieutenant Davis, and Sergeant Williams. 8 standard M4s followed in support positions. The formation advanced down a sunken lane barely wide enough for 2 tanks abreast. At 2:02 p.m., the lead element, Davis's tank, rounded a curve and immediately took fire. The 80mm round hit Davis's Sherman on the left sponson with a thunderous clang. The impact rocked the 30-ton vehicle sideways. Kowalski, 50 yards behind, saw the hit clearly. No explosion. The Sherman kept moving. Davis's voice came over the radio, strained but controlled. "Lead tank hit. Left side. Penetration. No fire. Continuing advance." Kowalski felt a surge of confidence. The wet stowage was working exactly as designed. Then the second Panther fired. The ambush was perfectly executed. 3 Panthers from Panzer Lehr Division had positioned themselves in a tree line 400 yards ahead, hull down behind earthen berms. The sunken lane created a perfect killing zone. American tanks had to advance single file with no room to maneuver. The second 88mm round hit Williams' Sherman through the front glacis. Again, penetration. Again, no explosion. Williams reversed his tank immediately, backing 30 yards behind a hedgerow. "All units, enemy armor identified, 400 yards, 12 o'clock, Lieutenant Davis transmitted. 3 Panthers, hull down positions. Supporting elements move up, prepare for flanking maneuver." The 8 standard M4 Shermans began maneuvering through adjacent fields, trying to find routes around the German position. Meanwhile, the 4 wet stowage tanks maintained position, drawing fire. The Panthers were methodical. Every 45 seconds, another 88mm round slammed into American armor. Kowalski's Sherman took a hit at 2:07 p.m. Right sponson, low angle, penetrating the hull just above the track. The impact was tremendous. The interior filled with smoke and fragments of spalling, metal torn from the armor's inner surface by the round's kinetic energy. Hayes, the bow gunner, screamed, but there was no fire. "Driver, reverse," Kowalski ordered. Jackson backed the Sherman behind cover. Kowalski dropped into the hull to check on Hayes. The bow gunner had taken spalling fragments in his left arm and shoulder, painful but not fatal. The 80mm round itself had lodged in the ammunition bin on the hull floor. Kowalski could see it. The German armor-piercing round, slightly deformed from impact, buried in the armored ammunition container. The water-glycerin jacket around the bin was steaming. The liquid had absorbed the round's thermal energy. The ammunition inside remained cool to the touch. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski breathed. "It actually works." Over the radio, Captain Walsh's voice. "All wet stowage units, maintain pressure. Standard units, flank positions achieved, prepare to engage." The engagement lasted 27 minutes. By 2:29 p.m., all four wet stowage Shermans had been hit, some multiple times. None exploded, none burned. Crews remained in their vehicles, continuing to fire. The psychological effect on the German tankers was devastating. Panther commanders were accustomed to American Shermans erupting in flames after one or two hits. Instead, these Shermans kept fighting. Even after penetrating hits, they reversed, repositioned, continued engaging. At 2:21 p.m., Sergeant Miller's Sherman, one of the flanking Standard M4s, got a side shot on the leftmost Panther at 180 yards. The 75 mm armor-piercing round penetrated the Panther's thinner side armor behind the turret. The German tank exploded spectacularly. Its ammunition cooked off instantly, killing the crew. 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Davis's wet stowage Sherman, despite having taken two 88 mm hits, landed a 75 mm round on the center Panther's turret ring. The German tank's turret jammed. Its crew bailed out. The remaining Panther withdrew at 2:29 p.m., reversing into the tree line and disappearing down a farm track. Company B held the position. 4 American tanks were damaged. 0 were destroyed by fire. 0 crew members died from ammunition explosions. 3 were wounded by spalling, including Hayes. All would survive. July 23, 1630 hours. Company B established a defensive perimeter while maintenance crews assessed damage. Army Ordnance sent a technical team from 2nd Armored Division headquarters to examine the wet stowage tanks. Captain John Martinez, Ordnance Corps, inspected each vehicle methodically. He photographed penetration holes, measured spalling patterns, examined ammunition bins. His assessment was unequivocal. "Every one of these tanks should have burned," Martinez said. Standard M4s with sponson ammunition storage would have experienced catastrophic cook-off within 5 to 8 seconds of penetration. The wet stowage system prevented ignition in all 4 cases. In Kowalski's tank, the 88 mm round is physically embedded in the ammunition bin. The round's thermal energy, estimated at 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit at impact, was absorbed by the glycerin solution. Ammunition remained below ignition temperature throughout the engagement. He turned to Captain Walsh. "This is the most significant survivability improvement we've seen in the Sherman since the start of the war. Wet stowage should be standard in every M4 produced." Walsh agreed. "How many wet stowage tanks are in the pipeline?" Production ramped up in May. By September, 70% of new Shermans will have wet stowage. Retrofit kits are being developed for existing vehicles. Wehrmacht intelligence first noticed the phenomenon in early August 1944. Panzer commanders reported American Shermans surviving multiple 88 mm hits without burning. Initial explanations ranged from improved armor to better crew training. The truth that Americans had developed a liquid-cooled ammunition storage system wasn't confirmed until captured technical manuals reached German analysis teams in September. Oberst, Colonel, Heinrich Bauer, Panzerlehr Division Operations Officer, wrote in his August 15 after-action report, "American tank losses from ammunition fires have decreased dramatically in the past 4 weeks. Units engaging M4 Sherman variants now observe reduced fire-related casualties even after successful penetrations." This suggests technical modifications to ammunition storage. Recommend immediate intelligence priority to identify and counter this development. The German response was tactical. Panzer commanders began targeting Sherman tracks and engine compartments rather than hull penetrations, attempting to achieve mobility kills instead of catastrophic destructions. But by then, the tide had shifted. American numerical superiority, combined with wet stowage survivability, made the Sherman Panther exchange ratio increasingly favorable to U.S. forces. By September 1944, wet stowage M4A3 Shermans constituted the majority of new deliveries to European theater units. Casualty rates from ammunition fires dropped from 60 to 80% of tank losses to approximately 15 to 20%. Crew survival rates improved correspondingly. Sergeant Kowalski trained other tank commanders on wet stowage advantages. "You can get hit and keep fighting," he explained to replacements at a training session in late August. "The Germans expect you to explode. When you don't, it creates hesitation. Use that hesitation. Return fire immediately after taking a hit. You've got seconds to minutes, not seconds to death." Lieutenant James Parker, commanding 2nd Platoon, 67th Armored Regiment, was one of those replacements. On October 3, 1944, near Aachen, Germany, his wet stowage Sherman took 3 88mm hits from a Tiger tank during a 30-minute engagement. The Tiger ultimately withdrew after running low on ammunition. Parker's tank, though heavily damaged, drove back to maintenance under its own power. Parker later wrote, "Kowalski was right. That first hit should have killed us. Instead, we stayed in the fight. The wet stowage gave us the confidence to engage German armor on more equal terms, not better tanks, better survival." The war ended May 8, 1945. Tommy Kowalski rotated home in June. He'd commanded his Sherman through 11 months of combat from Normandy to Germany, survived 4 separate 88mm hits, received the Silver Star for actions during Operation Cobra, and trained 23 replacement tank commanders on wet stowage tactics. He returned to Pittsburgh and went back to Jones and Laughlin Steel. He worked the mill for 33 years, never discussing the war in detail. When asked about his service, he'd say, "I was a tank commander, luckiest man in the European theater." He died in 1998 at age 79. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned military service but didn't elaborate. Nobody outside his family knew he'd been part of the combat testing of one of the war's most important technical innovations. The wet stowage Sherman influenced American tank design through the Cold War. Modern main battle tanks incorporate multiple ammunition fire suppression systems, all descended conceptually from those water-glycerin jackets around M4A3 ammunition bins. The M1 Abrams tank features blowout panels and isolated ammunition compartments, but the core principle remains: protect ammunition from thermal ignition to improve crew survival. German veterans later acknowledged the wet stowage impact. In a 1987 interview, former Panzer Commander Otto Carius stated, "By late 1944, we noticed American tanks no longer burned as easily. This was very concerning. Our advantage had been psychological. Americans feared the Panther. When their tanks stopped exploding, that fear diminished. The war became a numbers game we couldn't win." Between July and December 1944, the U.S. Army accepted delivery of approximately 7,400 wet stowage Sherman tanks. Combat data from European theater showed wet stowage tanks had 85% lower catastrophic fire rates compared to standard sponson ammunition M4s. Crew survival rates improved by 60%. Army Ordnance estimated the wet stowage system saved between 800 and 1,200 American lives in the final year of the European War. The modification cost $340 per tank, roughly $5,000 in 2024 dollars. 18 gallons of water-glycerin solution, properly sealed, gave tank crews the difference between instant death and the chance to bail out. July 23, 1944, remains significant in armored warfare history, not for a great battle but for a technical validation. That morning near St. Lo, 4 Sherman tanks demonstrated that survivability improvements could shift tactical calculus as dramatically as thicker armor or bigger guns. The Wehrmacht never understood what had changed until it was too late. Sometimes the weapon that wins wars isn't the biggest or fastest. Sometimes it's the one that lets you survive long enough to keep fighting. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone interested in military history. Comment below, what other overlooked WO2 innovations should we cover?